Trump walked straight up to the Queen's Guard like he owned Windsor Castle. "Get this guy out of my way," he told his Secret Service detail, pointing at the motionless soldier in the iconic red tunic. The guard didn't budge. Protocol said no one moves the Queen's Guard, not even presidents. But when Trump decided to push past anyway, breaking centuries of royal tradition captured on every camera in the courtyard, he had no idea he was about to learn that British military protocol doesn't bend for anyone. Now, before we show you what happened when the most powerful man in America met the immovable force of British tradition, make sure you're subscribed and drop a comment telling us what you think about respecting host country protocols. Now, let's get into it. Windsor Castle on a crisp July morning in 2018 was dressed in its finest ceremonial splendor for President Trump's first official state visit to the United Kingdom. The ancient stone walls that had witnessed nearly 1,000 years of British history now hosted American flags alongside the Union Jack, while Secret Service agents coordinated with Royal Protection officers to secure every inch of the grounds. It was the kind of diplomatic theatre that required months of planning, where every handshake was choreographed and every photo opportunity carefully staged to project the enduring strength of the special relationship between two nations. The morning had begun with all the pomp and circumstance that makes British royal occasions legendary around the world. Horse guards in pristine uniforms had escorted the presidential motorcade through the castle gates, while military bands played both Hail to the Chief and God Save the Queen with the precision that comes from centuries of practice. Television crews from networks on both sides of the Atlantic positioned themselves to capture every moment of what was being billed as a historic meeting between two of the world's most powerful leaders. Standing at his assigned post near the state entrance, Guardsman William Davies of the Coldstream Guards represented everything the Americans had come to see. 6 feet 4 inches of military precision in the full ceremonial dress that had become synonymous with British pageantry around the world. His scarlet tunic bore the battle honours of conflicts stretching back 3 centuries, while the towering bearskin cap added another foot to his already imposing height. The ceremonial rifle at his shoulder was perfectly positioned, every button polished to mirror brightness, every detail of his appearance reflecting the exacting standards that made the Queen's Guard legendary for their disciplined perfection. Davies had been standing at this post since 6 a.m., part of the enhanced security arrangements that surrounded any major state visit. His position wasn't decorative or arbitrary. It had been carefully chosen by Royal Protection officers to provide both ceremonial splendor and practical security coverage of one of the castle's most important entrances. The state entrance had welcomed everyone from Napoleon III to Ronald Reagan, and protocol dictated that it be guarded with the same meticulous attention to detail regardless of who was visiting. The presidential entourage treated the castle grounds like any other venue on Trump's global tour, a backdrop for American power projection rather than a living symbol of constitutional monarchy with its own ancient protocols. Secret Service agents had swept every corridor and secured every sightline, while advanced staff coordinated photo opportunities that would play well for domestic audiences back home. The American team had arrived 3 days earlier to coordinate security arrangements with their British counterparts, but there was one element they couldn't control, couldn't rearrange, and couldn't accommodate to American preferences: the Queen's Guard, whose positions were dictated by centuries of tradition rather than contemporary convenience. President Trump had spent the early morning hours in meetings with Prime Minister Theresa May, discussing everything from trade relationships to NATO obligations in sessions that would be analysed by diplomatic experts for months afterward. But the real purpose of his visit, at least from a public relations perspective, was the series of photo opportunities and ceremonial occasions that would demonstrate the enduring strength of Anglo-American cooperation. These moments required careful choreography to balance Trump's preference for informal interaction with the formal protocols that made royal occasions meaningful. Trump moved through the castle's state apartments with his characteristic blend of curiosity and impatience, examining portraits of long-dead monarchs while aides whispered historical context he seemed only partially interested in hearing. He had been briefed extensively on British royal protocol by State Department officials who understood that successful diplomacy often depended on showing proper respect for host nation customs. The briefings had covered everything from the proper way to address the Queen to the significance of ceremonial positions that couldn't be altered, even for the most important visitors. But Trump had built his brand around the idea that traditional rules were obstacles to be overcome, rather than traditions to be respected, and the formal constraints of royal protocol clearly chafed against his preference for improvisation and personal control. Throughout his business career and political rise, problems had been solved by hiring the right people, making the right deals, or simply demanding that inconvenient obstacles be removed. The concept of truly immovable constraints was foreign to his experience of wielding power. The collision between American presidential expectations and British royal tradition had been brewing since the M.O.N. meant Trump's team began planning the visit. American advance staff operated under the assumption that presidential needs took precedence over local customs, while British protocol officers worked from the principle that some traditions were literally non-negotiable, regardless of who was visiting. Both sides had tried to find accommodations that would satisfy everyone, but some differences in approach couldn't be bridged through diplomatic compromise. Davies had been briefed on the presidential visit with the same thoroughness that preceded any major state occasion. He understood that Trump was accustomed to having his security detail manage his environment completely, that American presidents typically moved through carefully controlled spaces where every variable had been anticipated and managed. But he also understood that his duty was to the crown rather than to visiting dignitaries, and that his position at the state entrance was dictated by regulations that had been refined over centuries of royal ceremonial. The morning's events had proceeded smoothly until Trump's departure from the state apartments, when the carefully choreographed schedule began to interact with the immovable realities of royal protocol. The president's photographers needed clear sightlines for the departure shots that would dominate evening news broadcasts, while British protocol officers needed to maintain the ceremonial standards that gave these occasions their meaning and dignity. The stage was set for a confrontation that neither side had anticipated, but both should have seen coming. But here's what Trump didn't know about Guardsman William Davies of the Coldstream Guards. 5 years earlier, he wasn't wearing ceremonial dress for royal occasions. He was lying prone behind a compound wall in Helmand Province, Afghanistan, with Taliban fighters trying to put rounds through his head while he coordinated defensive fire for a patrol base that had been under siege for 18 hours straight. Davies had volunteered for 3 consecutive tours in Afghanistan as an infantry soldier with the Coldstream Guards, one of the oldest and most distinguished regiments in the British Army. Each deployment had taught him lessons about duty, discipline, and the weight of traditions that connected him to centuries of soldiers who had served the crown in conflicts across the globe. The Coldstream Guards traced their lineage back to 1650, making them older than the United States itself, and every soldier who wore their uniform understood that they were inheriting a legacy built on sacrifice and unwavering dedication to duty. The first tour had been Davies' introduction to the reality of modern warfare, where enemy fighters used improvised explosive devices and suicide bombers to attack British forces, trying to bring stability to one of the world's most dangerous regions. He had learned to sleep through mortar attacks, to distinguish between friendly and enemy gunfire by sound alone, and to function normally while constantly aware that each patrol might be his last. More importantly, he had learned that the difference between professional soldiers and armed civilians was the ability to maintain discipline and effectiveness regardless of external circumstances. The second tour had tested everything Davies thought he knew about warfare and leadership. His platoon had been assigned to one of the most contested areas of Helmand Province, where Taliban fighters controlled territory just kilometers from British bases and attacked coalition forces with sophisticated tactics and powerful weapons. Davies had served as a section commander, responsible for 8 soldiers whose lives depended on his ability to make good decisions under pressure, while following orders that sometimes seemed impossible to execute safely. It was during the third tour that Davies had earned his reputation as one of the most reliable soldiers in his battalion. The siege at Patrol Base Wahid had been Davies' defining moment as a soldier, but it wasn't an isolated incident of heroism. It was the culmination of years of training, experience, and gradually increasing responsibility that had prepared him for the moment when everything went wrong and only his actions stood between his fellow soldiers and catastrophic defeat. Patrol Base Wahid was a small outpost that controlled a crucial road junction in northern Helmand, manned by 12 British soldiers, whose job was to disrupt Taliban supply lines and provide intelligence on enemy movements. The base was surrounded by hostile territory and dependent on helicopter resupply for everything from ammunition to medical supplies. When bad weather grounded helicopters for more than a week, the Taliban saw an opportunity to eliminate a British position that had been causing them significant problems. The attack had begun at dawn, with coordinated mortar fire from 3 different positions, followed by small arms fire from fighters who had spent days moving into position around the base's perimeter. Davies and his fellow soldiers had responded according to their training, taking defensive positions and calling for air support that was hours away due to competing priorities across the theatre of operations. What they hadn't anticipated was that the Taliban had brought enough fighters and ammunition to sustain an attack for nearly a full day. For 18 hours, Davies and 11 other soldiers had held their positions through constant enemy fire, coordinating their defensive efforts while rationing ammunition and treating wounded comrades with limited medical supplies. The Taliban fighters used everything from small arms fire to rocket-propelled grenades to try to breach the perimeter defenses, probing for weaknesses while maintaining pressure that prevented the British soldiers from resting or resupplying their positions. When the Taliban fighters finally managed to breach the outer wall of the compound using a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device, Davies had made a decision that would earn him the military cross and change his understanding of what duty really meant. Instead of falling back to secondary defensive positions as tactical doctrine suggested, he had held his position at the breach, using his SA-80 rifle to engage enemy fighters at point-blank range, while his fellow soldiers evacuated wounded comrades to safety. For 47 minutes, Davies had single-handedly held that breach against overwhelming odds, buying time for reinforcements to arrive and ultimately saving the lives of 3 critically wounded soldiers who wouldn't have survived evacuation under fire. He had expended every round of ammunition he carried, then continued fighting with weapons taken from fallen enemy fighters, maintaining his position through sheer force of will and an understanding that retreat meant death for soldiers who depended on him. The citation for his military cross described his actions as exceptional courage and selfless devotion to duty in the face of overwhelming enemy action. But Davies understood that his actions hadn't been exceptional at all. They had been the natural result of training, tradition, and an understanding that some things mattered more than personal survival. The same regimental traditions that connected him to soldiers who had fought at Waterloo and the Somme had given him the strength to hold that breach, just as they now gave him the strength to maintain his ceremonial duties, regardless of external pressure. After his combat tours ended, Davies had applied for the prestigious posting to the Queen's Guard, specifically because it allowed him to continue serving the Crown without the constant stress of life-or-death combat decisions. The selection process was rigorous, requiring not only exemplary military record but also the physical and psychological characteristics necessary to maintain perfect discipline during ceremonial duties that could last for hours. Only soldiers with proven records of exceptional service were considered for positions that would make them the public face of British military excellence. The ceremonial duties required the same discipline and attention to detail that had kept Davies alive in Afghanistan, but they allowed him to honour his service commitment in an environment where his primary challenges were weather and tourists rather than insurgents with automatic weapons. What many people didn't understand was that ceremonial postings like the Queen's Guard weren't rewards for past service. They were among the most demanding assignments in the British military, requiring soldiers who could maintain perfect standards under constant public scrutiny. What Davies brought to his ceremonial posting was an understanding that duty wasn't conditional on convenience or personal preference. In Afghanistan, he had learned that maintaining discipline under fire, literal fire, was often the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The same principles applied to his ceremonial duties, where maintaining protocol under pressure from entitled visitors or difficult weather conditions required the same kind of unwavering commitment to standards that had kept him alive in combat. The confrontation began the moment Trump emerged from the state apartments, with his entourage trailing behind him like a small army of advisors, photographers, and security personnel. He had spent the previous hour touring the castle's private quarters with Queen Elizabeth II, a carefully choreographed series of meetings and photo opportunities designed to showcase the personal relationship between the two leaders. The Queen, with her legendary diplomatic skill, had managed to make Trump feel genuinely welcomed while maintaining the formal protocols that gave royal occasions their meaning and dignity. But now, approaching the state entrance where his motorcade waited to transport him to the next event on his packed schedule, Trump encountered something that hadn't been part of his advance team's planning: Guardsman Davies, standing at perfect attention directly in the path that would provide the best camera angles for his departure. The presidential photographers had identified this particular shot as crucial for the day's visual narrative. A dramatic image of Trump departing Windsor Castle that would symbolize the success of his state visit. Trump's initial reaction was the reflexive assumption that this was simply another logistical detail that needed to be managed by the army of professionals whose job was to ensure that presidential events proceeded flawlessly. In his experience, when inconvenient obstacles appeared in important moments, you solved the problem by giving clear instructions to the people whose job was to manage such things. The idea that some obstacles might be genuinely immovable hadn't figured prominently in his experience of wielding presidential power. "Get this guy out of my way," Trump said to his Secret Service detail leader, gesturing toward Davies with the casual dismissiveness of someone who had never encountered a situation where his preferences couldn't be accommodated. "I need a clear shot for the photographers, and he's blocking the whole entrance. Just have him step aside for 2 minutes." The Secret Service agent, a 20-year veteran who had managed presidential movements in dozens of countries, found himself in the unprecedented position of having to explain that some elements of a presidential visit couldn't be rearranged to accommodate American preferences. He had coordinated with British security services extensively during the planning process, and the immobility of ceremonial guard positions had been explained clearly during it, in the briefings that most people seem to have forgotten in the moment. "Sir, that's a Queen's Guard," the agent explained with the patient professionalism that comes from years of managing presidential expectations in foreign countries. "British protocol doesn't allow us to move their ceremonial positions. We'll need to work around him, but we can get excellent shots from alternative angles." Trump's expression shifted from mild annoyance to genuine puzzlement as he processed this information. In his worldview, security considerations always took precedence over ceremonial concerns, and presidential needs superseded local customs when conflicts arose. The idea that a single soldier's ceremonial position could take priority over the departure arrangements for the most powerful man on earth seemed to violate every principle of logic and hierarchy that had governed his experience of international travel. "What do you mean we can't move him?" Trump asked, his voice rising just enough to attract the attention of nearby British protocol officers who had been hoping to avoid exactly this kind of cultural collision. "He's just standing there doing nothing. It's not like he's actually guarding anything important. Just tell him to step aside for 2 minutes while we get the shot. Then he can go back to whatever he was doing." The senior British protocol officer, Sir Malcolm Henderson, approached with the kind of careful deference that diplomatic incidents are made of. Henderson was a career diplomat who had managed royal visits for 3 decades, shepherding everyone from Japanese emperors to African presidents through the complexities of British ceremonial protocol. He understood that successful diplomacy often required patient explanation of customs that seemed arbitrary to outsiders, but formed the foundation of British constitutional government. "Mr. President, I'm afraid the Queen's Guard positions are determined by centuries of royal protocol," Henderson explained, with the diplomatic skill that had made him invaluable to 3 monarchs. "They're not movable for any occasion, regardless of the visitor's importance. We can certainly arrange alternative camera angles that would work beautifully and actually provide more dramatic shots of your departure." But Trump's frustration was building as he realized that his departure from Windsor Castle, one of the culminating moments of his state visit, was going to be constrained by what seemed to him like arbitrary British stubbornness. He had spent months preparing for this visit, understanding its importance for both domestic and international audiences, and the idea that his photographers couldn't capture the exact images they needed because of one inflexible soldier seemed to epitomize everything that frustrated him about diplomatic protocol. The growing crowd of officials, journalists and photographers sensed the developing tension. creating the kind of public pressure that can transform minor diplomatic disagreements into international incidents. American reporters were beginning to document what looked like British inflexibility, while British journalists were capturing what appeared to be American disrespect for cherished traditions. The moment was taking on symbolic weight that neither side had intended, but both would have to manage carefully. "This is completely ridiculous," Trump announced, loud enough for the growing crowd of officials and media personnel to hear clearly. "I'm the President of the United States, visiting as a guest of your Queen. We're talking about moving one guy 3 feet to the left for 2 minutes. How is this even a problem that we're discussing?" Davies remained at perfect attention throughout this exchange, his eyes fixed on the middle distance, his breathing steady and controlled, his entire bearing radiating the kind of disciplined stillness that takes years to master. To casual observers, he might have seemed oblivious to the controversy swirling around him, but his military training had prepared him to be acutely aware of developing situations while maintaining the appearance of complete indifference to external distractions. The tension in the courtyard was becoming palpable as American and British officials realized they were witnessing exactly the kind of cultural misunderstanding that could generate negative headlines on both sides of the Atlantic for weeks afterward. The Americans were genuinely puzzled by British inflexibility on what seemed like a minor ceremonial detail, while the British were increasingly concerned about American disrespect for traditions that formed the foundation of their constitutional system. Henderson tried once more to find a diplomatic solution that would satisfy both sides' needs without compromising British protocol. "Mr. President, if I might suggest, we have alternative positions that would actually provide more dramatic photographic opportunities while respecting the ceremonial requirements that make these occasions meaningful. The Queen herself has always found that working with our traditions rather than against them produces the most satisfactory results." But Trump had reached the point where accommodation felt like capitulation, where accepting alternative arrangements would seem like acknowledging that British customs took precedence over American presidential prerogatives. It was exactly the kind of symbolic confrontation that could define how his visit was perceived by both domestic and international audiences, and his political instincts told him that backing down would be interpreted as weakness. That's when Trump made the decision that would transform a minor diplomatic inconvenience into a potential international incident that would be analyzed and debated by constitutional scholars and diplomatic historians for years afterward. Instead of accepting the alternative arrangements that his photographers could certainly have managed, instead of recognizing that some British customs might be worth respecting even when they were inconvenient, Trump decided to solve the problem through direct action. "Fine," he announced, stepping toward Davies's position with the determined stride of someone who had never been told no by anyone who really mattered. "If nobody else can handle this simple problem, I'll handle it myself." Trump's decision to physically bypass Davies created a moment of diplomatic crisis that would be analyzed by constitutional scholars and international relations experts for years afterward. As the President of the United States stepped directly into the ceremonial space that centuries of protocol had reserved exclusively for the British royal family and their designated representatives, multiple layers of security, protocol, and constitutional tradition collided in ways that no briefing document could have anticipated. Davies' response was immediate, professional, and absolutely final. Without breaking his ceremonial bearing or moving from his assigned position, he shifted his weight almost imperceptibly in a way that made it clear that Trump's intended path would require physical contact with a Queen's Guard. The movement was so subtle that television cameras would later debate whether it had actually occurred, but every military professional in the courtyard recognized it as the quiet assertion of non-negotiable boundaries. "Sir, I cannot move from this position," Davies said, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard by Trump and the immediate circle of officials surrounding them. The words were spoken with perfect military courtesy, but they contained an unshakable finality that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation, a request for accommodation, or an invitation for further discussion. It was a simple statement of constitutional reality. Some things in Britain don't bend, even for American presidents. The effect of these 7 words was electric. Trump stopped mid-stride, clearly sun-on, caught off guard by the realization that he had encountered perhaps the first person in decades who was genuinely immune to presidential authority. For a moment that lasted several heartbeats too long, the President of the United States and a British guardsman stared at each other across a cultural divide that represented fundamentally different understandings of power, tradition, and the relationship between individual authority and institutional duty. The crowd of officials, photographers, and journalists held its collective breath as they witnessed something unprecedented in the modern era of American presidential travel. A moment when presidential expectations encountered an absolutely immovable force and discovered which one would have to give way. The silence stretched long enough for everyone present to understand that they were witnessing a defining moment in the relationship between two allied nations. Sir Malcolm Henderson moved with practiced diplomacy to defuse the situation before it could escalate into genuine international embarrassment. His approach to Trump balanced respect for presidential authority with firm defense of British constitutional principles, acknowledging the president's importance while making clear that some traditions transcended even the most important diplomatic relationships. "Mr. President, if I may respectfully suggest an alternative arrangement," Henderson said, his voice carrying the diplomatic authority that came from representing not just the British government, but the Crown itself. "We can provide excellent photographic opportunities from a position that would actually be more dramatic, while respecting the ceremonial protocols that give these occasions their meaning and historical significance." Henderson gestured toward a location that would actually provide superior camera angles while honoring the traditions that had made Windsor Castle a symbol of constitutional monarchy for nearly 1,000 years. The suggested position would allow Trump's photographers to capture images that emphasized both American presidential authority and British royal tradition without requiring either side to compromise their fundamental principles. Trump's political instincts, honed through decades of public appearances and media management, recognized that he had reached one of those crucial moments where graceful accommodation would serve him better than continued confrontation. The presence of international media meant that his response to this unexpected challenge would be scrutinized and analyzed far beyond the immediate diplomatic context. How he handled this moment would become part of his presidential legacy and his relationship with America's closest ally. After a pause that seemed to last forever, but probably lasted only seconds, Trump stepped back from Davies's position and allowed himself to be guided to the alternative location that Henderson had suggested. The movement was conducted with enough dignity to avoid the appearance of retreat, while acknowledging that some British customs deserved respect, even when they were inconvenient for American presidential preferences. "I guess when you're visiting the Queen, you follow the Queen's rules," Trump said with a laugh that was clearly intended to diffuse the tension while maintaining his presidential dignity. The comment was picked up by every microphone in the courtyard and would later be quoted in diplomatic analyses as either evidence of presidential grace under pressure or acknowledgement of the limits to American influence in foreign countries. The departure ceremony proceeded without further incident, with Trump's motorcade eventually leaving Windsor Castle after what would be remembered as a largely successful state visit despite the protocol friction. The alternative camera position actually provided superior photographic opportunities, capturing images that emphasized both American presidential power and British royal tradition in ways that satisfied both sides' media objectives. Davies maintained his position throughout the remainder of the ceremony, returning to his ceremonial duties as if nothing unusual had occurred. His successful defense of protocol under unprecedented pressure would be noted in his service record and discussed in military circles as an example of how proper training and unwavering commitment to duty could provide strength in the most unexpected and challenging situations. The incident would later be analyzed by diplomatic historians as a perfect example of how cultural differences between allied nations could create unexpected challenges even in the most carefully planned international events. Both Trump and Davies had ultimately performed their roles appropriately. Trump by recognizing when diplomatic accommodation was the wise course of action, and Davies by maintaining the constitutional principles that made British royal ceremonies meaningful expressions of national identity rather than mere tourist attractions. British media coverage of the incident focused on Davies's professional performance under pressure, with several newspapers noting that his actions perfectly embodied the discipline and dedication that made the Queen's Guard legendary around the world. American coverage was more mixed, with some commentators praising Trump's eventual accommodation, while others criticized the initial confrontation as unnecessary diplomatic friction. The long-term effects of the incident were ultimately positive for both countries' relationship, providing a teaching moment about the importance of mutual respect in international diplomacy. Trump's eventual accommodation of British protocol was seen as evidence of his respect for Allied traditions, while Davy's firm but respectful defence of his duties demonstrated the professional excellence that made British military personnel valued partners in international security cooperation. Years later, when Davies was asked about the incident during a regimental dinner, his response was characteristically modest. "I was just doing my job, following the same protocols that guardsmen have followed for centuries. The position belongs to the Crown, not to me, and I couldn't move it for anyone, no matter how important they might be." Would you have expected even a US president to respect British royal protocol over personal convenience? Think world leaders should adapt to host country traditions or expect accommodation when they visit? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and these conversations matter more than you know. If this story reminded you that some traditions are bigger than any individual, no matter how powerful, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you never miss the next one. Share this with someone who needs to remember that real strength comes from respecting other nations' customs and understanding when principles matter more than convenience. More stories about when political power meets unchangeable tradition are waiting right here on your screen. Click one now and I'll see you tomorrow with another reminder that the most important diplomatic skill is knowing when to show respect for things that are bigger than yourself. Until then, remember, sometimes the most powerful person in the room discovers there are forces even they can't move, and that's not a weakness. That's how civilization works.